The Nikon ZF is an incredibly capable street photography camera. And whether you want to use it for street or for portraits or for wedding photography or anything like that, you can accomplish a lot with this camera. I've made a bunch of videos about it, but a lot of people have been asking me about my settings, how I'm setting up this camera, and what settings I'm using to achieve what I am photographing. So that's what we're going to go through today. It's going to be a little bit more technical and nerdy than some of my videos, but I think it's going to be really helpful. So sit back, grab a cup of coffee, and go through the settings with me. And whatever I'm saying about this, I would say like 90% of it applies to how I set up my Z6 III as well, with the addition of a couple little buttons that are different. But overall, this setting should work really well for you no matter what you're shooting. So let's get into it. And if you don't know who I am and you just stumbled across this page, my name is Chris Tejas. I'm a professional photographer and videographer based in Ontario, Canada. I mainly shoot portraits and events and weddings, although I do a lot of commercial work and video work as well. But basically it's all centering around photographing people. So these are the settings I use when people are paying me to take their photo, or the settings that I'm using if I just want to go out and take photos myself. Let's get into it. Okay, so looking at the way that I have this set up right now, if we look at the standard display, I have this setting. So if you cycle through your displays, you can see a few different ones and you have control over what goes on to each of these. This one I think is the most busy and complicated looking to me. There's just a lot to pay attention to, and most of the stuff I don't really need to know. So I spend most of my time on this menu and the following one. So I have my basic exposure and then my exposure compensation on the right here. It'll tell me that if I want to use the touch to autofocus, I have that set up, that kind of thing. But that's about it. From there, if you hit it again, this brings up my histogram as well as my horizon lines, which I find really helpful sometimes. And then this one here is just totally blank. However, if you do half press the shutter, you'll see that your basic information like your shutter speed, your f-stop, and your ISO will come up. Looking at the I menu, from here, you can control a lot of different stuff on your camera. Basically, I have mine set up to have my focus mode, so whether I want that to be an autofocus, continuous, single, or manual focus. I have my area mode, subject detection. I also have that mapped to a button, but this is helpful if you need it. So using the front dial, I can change which one I am actually adjusting. Using the back dial, I can go back and forth between whichever one I want. From there, I have my ISO. I have metering set up. I have white balance, multiple exposure. I don't do a ton of multiple exposure, but I like having it really conveniently placed so that when I do it, I can just have it on and off. And there's lots of different buttons here, so I might as well. Release mode, so this is whether I want to go with single, low, high with my drive settings. Auto bracketing, custom controls. This one I think is super helpful to have because there's not a lot of custom controls on the ZF, so it's helpful that you can just kind of dive in right away and start adjusting those. Choosing image area, so this allows me to go into my full frame, into my crop sensor, or into various different aspect ratios. Active D-lighting, now this will only apply to things like your video or to your JPEGs, but I do like to work with JPEGs sometimes, so I have this on here. And then finally, picture control. So this is a custom one that I have set up called Fujichrome, but there's lots of different ones that you can use, all sorts of crazy stuff, but we'll keep it on there for now. If we jump into the menu itself, we won't go through everything because that would take forever, but I'll take you through some of the basic things that are important to know. So primary slot selection, you have a micro SD or regular SD card in this. If you're using the Z6 III, you have a CF Express Type B or an SD card. My primary slot is going to be my SD card. I use the second one for backup. Secondary slot function. Secondary slot function, it depends on what I'm shooting. If I'm just shooting for fun, meaning that I'm not getting paid, I set it to raw, primary, JPEG, secondary, meaning that it will save the raw photo to my SD card and a JPEG to the micro SD. I really like shooting this way. However, if I am shooting a paid gig, then I will set it to backup. And if that's the case, then usually what I'll end up doing is adjusting my image quality as well. So we'll get to that in a second, but let's put this back to raw plus JPEG. This is the image quality. So this is where you can cycle between if you want to shoot just raw, or if you want to shoot raw plus JPEG or just JPEG. I have mine set to raw plus JPEG normal star. ISO sensitivity. For this one right now, we are in manual ISO, but if we go to auto, all of a sudden we can control a bunch of stuff here. So I have my max sensitivity set to 16,000. It can go above that. I just find I rarely shoot in anywhere where I need to, but you could easily have this at 25,600, be just fine. Yeah, it's going to be grainy and noisy, but I mean, you're shooting in the dark at that point. Minimum shutter speed, this is helpful. So if you're shooting, you want to make sure, especially if you're shooting people, that you don't fall below a certain shutter speed usually. Now, it does depend on the situation. If people are more static or you have more control, you might be able to get away with going lower. But I would say minimum, you want to go 1/250th of a second, and that is going to be kind of your best bet. I would say for most of my street work, I actually set it to 1/500th of a second or higher, but we'll leave it at 1/250th. Here, just know that that's going to be like the bare minimum. Usually for street, 1/500th of a second. White balance. So there's a bunch of different things you can do with white balance, and it's all relative to whether you're going to shoot in auto or in JPEG. Generally speaking, I use Auto 1, which is keep overall atmosphere. I know a lot of people do like to use keep warm lighting colors, which is Auto 2. For me, this seems to work just fine, but it does depend on what I'm shooting. Sometimes if I know that I'm going to be shooting street and I know that I don't want to have the camera doing extra work, or I know that I just want to keep a consistent white balance throughout everything, and this is the case actually with weddings a lot of the time too, I will go down to either direct sunlight or cloudy. I don't like going so far as to shade. I find that warms it up too much, but I do like the look of cloudy for a lot of my street work. Even if it is a sunny day, I find like that warm color kind of works well with how I like to edit. But I'll kind of bounce around between direct sunlight, cloudy, and then Auto 1. Picture control. So like I said, I have a custom picture control that I do like to use, and that's one that I've called Fujichrome for no real reason other than I find it gives a little bit of that depth that you get out of the classic Chrome out of Fuji, but it is quite different. It's just a name, so don't freak out. And then I have a few other ones I've messed around with that I like. All of them, though, do require that you pay attention to your white balance, I find quite a bit. But this Fujichrome one is a little more resilient. But regardless, you can set to whatever you want. I would say for most of the time when I am shooting, I really like either rich tone portrait or standard, or I'm going to be in this Fujichrome setting that I've created for the JPEGs. If I'm shooting professional work, probably I'm just going to be in standard or potentially rich tone portrait because those seem to work well. And I know I'm going to be adjusting the raw file later anyways. So it really comes down to what looks most pleasing to you and to your clients, because if you're shooting professionally, then yeah, you probably want to make sure that the image on the back looks pretty good. And if you shoot like a super flat profile and you go to show them the image, I find that it's less exciting for them. So we'll keep it here for now. Manage picture controls, where you can load different picture controls, but that is a story for another time. Active delighting. I don't always have this on. I kind of bounce between off and normal. That just basically raises your shadows and brings your highlights down and gives you a little bit more control over the dynamic range of the image. But again, it only affects your JPEGs, so not super important. Metering, we'll go to that real quick. Metering is something that I bounce around with a lot, and that's actually one of the reasons why I love shooting on the Z6 III, because there's more customizability with the buttons, and I can map my metering. I actually map it to my record button when I'm shooting photo, and that allows me to just really quickly change my metering. But going between matrix, center weighted spot, and highlight metering, I find most of the time I'm either going to be in spot or in matrix. But if I'm shooting in something like aperture priority, or any of my functions are in auto setting, so right now I'm in like auto ISO, then I am just going to ride my exposure compensation wheel, and that is how I'm going to adjust whether I have more or less of that exposure happening, rather than messing around with my metering. Because in theory, let's say it's really blown out because there's a bunch of windows, but I'm trying to photograph somebody right in front of me. I could put it into spot metering, or I could just bring down my exposure compensation wheel a little bit, and that also works. I'm gonna do a quick pause here just to say thank you to everyone who's been watching, and if you're not subscribed already but you like what you're seeing, please subscribe. There's gonna be more videos like this on the way, and it's super helpful to see those numbers rise. It makes me more capable of making interesting content, so thank you so much. Let's get back to the video. Okay, subject detection options. I have it set to auto. I think this is actually really helpful. I like that it has an auto function because now it can just bounce between people, animals, vehicles, airplanes, which is nice. If I know that I'm going to be in a scenario where there are going to be like animals and people, and I just want to focus on the animals or just on the people, then I will set it and it will do a better job. But usually I'm not in a scenario like that with what I shoot. So looking at all of our custom settings here, like I said, there's a million of them, but I'll just go over a few that I think are important. AFC priority selection and AFS priority selection. So this is basically saying to the camera, I want you to place equal importance on getting the focus and taking the photo. So if you set it to just focus, it will not take a photo until it's in perfect focus. If you set it to release, it will prioritize getting the photo more so than getting the focus. It'll still do autofocus, it's just it will prioritize getting the photo. Focus and release is kind of a balance of both. So that's what I have it set to for autofocus continuous. For AFS, I set it to focus. This is a very important thing to know. So if you're shooting with a flash, like a little on-camera flash, and it is not specifically made to work with Nikon, so whether that is like a Godox flash that is actually made for Nikon, or if it's one that is, let's say, made for Fuji, like I have an old Fuji one that I can put on here, it will still flash. However, it will not show you the proper type of like exposure preview, because normally when you put a flash on here, it stops giving you exposure preview and it goes into like basically showing you almost closer to like what like a DSLR would show, just the scene in front of you. That's really important and helpful because it helps with focusing, it helps with knowing what your image looks like. The only way to achieve that with a non-Nikon specific flash, like some of the little flashes that I have that I use sometimes, is you have to take your Starlight view and turn that on. So we just put it on, look at this. Even if I make changes to my shutter speed, I'm not seeing an image preview, but we can see that I'm way underexposed. Now, if we go back into our menu, back into shooting display, and we turn this off, you can see how dark the actual photo is going to be. So that is an important note. But again, that'll only really apply if you're shooting flash. And I would say that that's most of the stuff that actually matters in the menu when it comes to us going out and shooting street photography or any other type of photography that we're setting this up. There are going to be fringe cases where you need specific things, but let's go into the button customization now. So looking at the button customization, the yellow highlight will be the one that we're working on. So right now I have my front button set to my white balance. So what that means is that when I press and hold my front button, I can then cycle through whatever I want to use for my white balance. And I find that very, very helpful. The front button will allow me to go through some of the finer details up top, or I can hit down and then I can start adjusting things. So I can change my like hue and stuff like that. My AEL, AFL, also something that people would use for back button focusing. I use that to jump into my 3D tracking. And this is a good time to talk about autofocus. So I have my autofocus set up with all area autofocus. So right now, if I half press down the shutter, it is just going to decide what it wants to focus on. I can always override that by hitting, anywhere on the screen, and it will focus there until I hit OK, and then it'll bounce back into my autofocus settings that I have set up already, which is the all area. Now, because I like to photograph people, and especially when I'm doing something like a wedding or something like that, it's really, really important that I have the ability to do 3D tracking for how I shoot. I find that really helpful. So the way I have that set up is if I press the AEL AFL button, all of a sudden you'll see this little box comes up. That looks like just a center point box, but let's say I throw something in front of it and I focus on it. Can I get far enough? Can I get far enough? Great. Now if I move that around, it will follow it. Now I'm going in and out of its focus plane, so that's a little tricky for it, but generally speaking, you can see that that's how it works. And then when I let go of it, it just goes back to focusing regularly, which is really nice. So that is how I have that button set up. Beyond that, it's all pretty basic. I don't have a lot of other different setups. My display button's a display button. My playback button's a playback button. The center button, okay, I set to reset my autofocus point. So if, for example, I was to put this onto just single point autofocus, and then I was to move my button around a bunch and say I want to focus right there, and then I want to get back to the center quickly, I just hit the OK button and I'm back. I'm over and then I'm back. I'm over and then I'm back. So that's how I have that set up. And the only other particular button that I have set up that I think is really important is this guy here. So my record button is set up to help me with my ISO. So the way this is set up is when I hit my record button, which you can see is on top of the camera, it will jump into ISO, and then you know that because it's yellow. So that's helpful. So we know we're working on this. There's two dials on this, right? You have your front dial and your rear dial. The front dial, all I have to do is move that, and I will go back and forth between auto and manual ISO. So if I have it set up for auto ISO, it will just pick the ISO based on what it thinks is best. Now, if I move this back and forth, it will adjust what it says is my ISO, and it will keep that as sort of like a point of reference for my minimum ISO. However, it will not actually adjust the ISO to that unless it needs to. So right now we're in auto ISO. If I just switch that, all of a sudden we're out of auto ISO, and then I can adjust however I want, up or down. Really simple. If I want to get back into auto ISO, I hold down the record button and I push it back and forth. It's not the best. I do prefer having like a third wheel or dial that controls that because it's just much faster, but having to just press one button and then do it is not really that bad. And it does mean that it's harder to accidentally change your ISO, which is nice as well. Now, this is how I have everything set up if I'm not using the top dials. But if I do want to use the top dials, things are a little bit different. I don't actually change any of my custom settings per se, but I do change my workflow a little bit. So let's get into that. Okay, so if you do want to use more of the manual dials on here, which I recommend trying, you don't always have to do it, but I do recommend trying because I think it can be a really helpful way to learn your exposure triangle and stuff like that. And it also is a really fast and efficient way to know what your settings are before you even start shooting. What you can do is you can use the top dial on this side to control your ISO and the top dial on this side to control your shutter speed. Now right now the dial is locked. I can't change it. And that's because anytime it's in C or in third of a step, it locks itself so it doesn't accidentally bump out of that. And that is definitely helpful. If we want to use this, you're going to press down that button and then you can start to move this around. So keep in mind though that if you want to use these dials, then using something like any auto function for something like your aperture or something like that is going to become a little bit more tricky, and you do really have to kind of focus on working manually with this setup. What you can do is you can do your ISO, your shutter speed, and then you can take a control ring if you do have a lens that has a control ring like this one, and you can set that to your aperture. Or if you're using a lens that does have an aperture ring, then you just use that. And then you have very manual experiences that you can use for everything. The only downside being that if I'm trying to use this as my aperture ring and the camera's off, I can't physically change my aperture. The camera has to be on to do that. So it's not a perfect system, but it's something you can experiment with. Anyways, using these top dials, another kind of key thing is going to be talking about this dial here. And that's my most used dial, because to be honest, even though I really like using the dials on this, for a lot of what I shoot, I'm going to be in fairly auto settings insofar as I'm going to control everything using my dials here, or I'm going to be in like aperture priority. And I am going to think about this top dial here as my exposure compensation wheel is going to really affect things the most. So let's say I have things set up where I am in a manual shutter speed, I am in a auto ISO, and I am also choosing my aperture. So that would be, you know, manual minus the ISO. What I will do is rather than changing my ISO all the time, I will change my exposure compensation. And so it's sort of like, in a way, having an ISO dial, because you're making everything else manual, but you're making the ISO auto, which means that when you're moving this, the only thing it can change is your ISO. So that's kind of like a workaround. You can go up to 3 stops over and 3 stops under. The other thing you can do is you can set it to C, and then you can control it with dials, but I find this to be perfectly fine. It's pretty rare I'm ever going to want to go more than 3 stops under, and so that's totally fine. It works really well. So that's the top dials, and that's how I would use them. And the last little thing to think about is going to be this little switch here. So this is how you switch between black and white, color, and video. You know, I have talked a lot about using this for video, and I do love using this for video, but I am primarily using this as my stills camera, which means that I'm usually bouncing between my color and my black and white. The great thing about the black and white switch is that it doesn't actually change any of your other settings. All it does is put you into a black and white color mode. It won't affect your raw files. Your raw files will still be color, but the JPEGs will be affected, but it won't affect any other settings. So if I have this all dialed in, I have my exposure where I want it, I have my aperture where I want it, and then I switch between color and black and white, the only thing that changes is that that color profile that you're seeing. And I find that really helpful because it means I don't have to worry about a bunch of different settings changing on me. Again, though, it only affects your JPEGs, so you don't have to worry about that if you're only shooting raw. I find that I use this a lot when I'm shooting street because it helps me to push distractions away a little bit and just focus in on my composition, and a lot of people talk about that being helpful for them as well. So that's something to know. All right, so thank you so much for watching. Hopefully that was helpful. Let me know in the comments below what you think. How do you set up your ZF? Is it crazy different from me? Is it similar? Did you learn something? And just let me know where you're from. I like knowing where people are from. So hit me in the comments below and let me know where you are from. All right, peace.